The Eevee Viewport for Blender is now available for very early testing. Once you've got it working, it's a lot of fun to try it out. However, there are a few things that I think you should know which hopefully will make your experience with it a little more pain-free. We've got real-time PBR shaders, we've got volumetrics, and we've got volumetric shadows. We've got reflection spheres and, well, a whole load of reflections actually. We've also got a bucket load of post-processing and more. So we'll go over where Blender is up to with it so far. To get Blender 2.8 with its Eevee rendering engine, let's head over to the blender.org download page, and we'll click on this download here. And hey, look at that! It's a space render from Gleb and I's Space VFX course. So now I fight back the tears of pride and joy and scroll down to the bleeding edge section, click download experimental builds, and over here you can see some Blender 2.8 downloads. Choose the Blender 2.8 for your system. For me, I'm going to choose this one since I'm on Windows 64-bit. And once downloaded, we can unzip it and click the blender.exe file. Then we'll be transported to the magical land of 2.8. So aside from these basic objects that I've added into the scene, your version of Blender 2.8 might actually look a little bit different to this. And that's just going to be due to the rapidly evolving nature of Blender 2.8 right now. And especially up at the top might be looking a little bit different. And it's up at the top that I wanted to draw the attention initially anyway, since we have our rendering engine pull down list. And as you can see, Eevee is set as default. And if we click on this, we can see we've also got an option for clay. So let's just take a quick look into our clay rendering. I'm going to pull out the properties sidebar here. You can see our rendering tab has changed, and it's essentially kind of our solid shading view, or kind of matte caps with benefits, if you like. Since if we click on our clay collection material preview here, you can see this is reminiscent of all those that we saw in earlier versions of Blender in the matte cap settings. And if we can click on any of these to just change what we can see here. I'm just going to stick with this very flat, diffuse looking clay render though. And if we take down our cavity strength to 0 and our edge strength to 0, this is basically what we had before. The samples aren't going to be doing anything right now. They smooth out the settings we've just turned down. But now we can just concentrate on what's happening with these top 4 sliders. You can see we can rotate around the lighting that is suggested by this matte cap. And we can see we can shift the hue, the saturation, and the value. In fact, this is kind of quite interesting because we can take the value right down, say something like almost right down to the bottom. And then we can set our edge strength up to say 1. I mean, in fact, let's crank that right up. Let's go way, way up like 30 or so. Let's increase our samples since it's looking a little bit speckly over there. So I'm going to take that up quite high, something like 100 or so. And now we kind of have this very, very cool worn edges kind of a look to our very hard objects anyway. And this isn't dependent on geometry, which means if we tab into edit mode, press W and subdivide a few times, you can see the size of our edges, the distance they spread is not being affected whatsoever. I only mention this because the pointedness node that is available to us in Cycles can be used to create these kinds of effects, but it is kind of limited based on the topology that we've got in that object for the kind of worn edge distance sizes that we get. So here I'm subdividing this object and hitting F6 to bring up the tool settings and increasing the number of cuts, and that's informing the size of those worn edges. But here we have a distance setting, and this is going to be the same distance for cavities and edges. I don't know whether they're going to split that up at one point. And since this distance affects both of these, let's turn the cavities back on. The trouble is though, we can't really see the dark on dark, so to have the cavities show, we'll lighten the overall value. When we increase the cavities value, we can definitely see them now. Basically, this is our ambient occlusion, or darkness in the corners, the creases, or, well, of course, cavities, as the name might suggest. What would be pretty cool is if we could break that out, then we can create a sort of convexity map that we could use to blend textures together. Scratch textures for the edges and grime and dirt textures in the cavities, for example, as we might do in 2.79 with the pointiness node. So something that needs to really be stressed is this is very early days in the development, so things are buggy and things are missing. For example, there is no toggle shading with the Z key. Hit that sucker all you like, and the only place you'll get it doing anything is in ye olde Blender Render. So if I hit the Z key now, you can see we can toggle that wireframe. Elsewhere though, there is no wireframe. So let's get back over to Eevee rendering and try our Z key there. And again, no wireframe. So before actually opening 2.8, to try this out, I'd suggest setting up a basic scene in a regular build of Blender first, or in other words, 2.78 or 2.79. For example, I wanted to import an FBX, but was met with nope. So I would bring your models in and then build up your materials in 2.8. So here's the default basic scene content that I've exported from Unreal Engine 4. I did this in Blender 2.79 and now I've opened it up in 2.8. And now that we're back in 2.8, we need to talk about PBR just for a few seconds. So for good results in a PBR setup, we need an environment to reflect. And the easiest way to get started is to just use an environment texture for the world material. So here I have the node editor. We're set to not show the object material, but the world material. Here I have this basic setup. It's just an environment texture, which is this HDR here that I've baked out of Unreal Engine. Just the default sky. And we can see that in the background of our viewport here. Oh, and a quick tip. If we press N to open up our properties sidebar here and scroll down to world background, you can see toggling this doesn't really have any effect. If you want to set up your own manual toggle, I've just kind of created a few nodes down here which will help. So if I just bring these up, if we just have our world output come out of this mix shader here, and let's plug this background into the first socket there. You can see I'm just using this mix shader and then I'm using a light path node, and there is camera ray output into the factor. So if it's seen by the camera, we're just going to use this black color, so we could change this to whatever we want. And then otherwise for the rest of the scene, it's going to be reflecting our actual environment texture. I'm just going to select this mix shader and Alt-D just to pop it out though. And now we're back to where we were with that. All right, to explain more, I've rearranged things around a little bit. In the node window, we're still looking at our world material. So I'm going to switch that over to the object material. And I have this chair selected at the moment. I've gone ahead and set up the textures for this material in a similar way to how they're set up in the default Unreal Engine 4 content. So although this material might look a little bit crazy, it's actually pretty simple. And all we need to focus on right now is this metallic shader. So this is one of the PBR shaders that we have in Eevee. It's one of two main types. If I go Shift A and take a look at the shader options here, we've got the metallic shader and we've got a specular shader. If we just click that up, it's basically very equivalent, but you do need to author your textures differently to get these two to give equivalent results. And if you're familiar with the principled PBR shader that we've already done a brief video on, then you're actually already familiar with the metallic workflow. And also, if you've done any work in Unreal Engine 4, that favors the metallic workflow. So to keep things simple, we'll just be using the metallic shader here. So with that, I'm just going to delete this guy. So something that's really cool with Eevee is we can work with our shader, but also you can see I'm branching out from these texture nodes into this principled shader up at the top, and that means we can switch over to cycles rendering, and now this stuff will take over, but all our texturing is still the same. There's a little problem right now though, which is if we switch back over to Eevee, you can see that there is actually a little bit of support for this principled shader and this material output, and it's actually ignoring this material output at the moment. So for example, if I control left click across that, you can see everything's gone black, even though we're in Eevee and we have this material output working fine. So what we want to do is we want to actually just for the moment delete that and just use this one material output. So I'm going to hook that up to the surface output, and now you can see we've got something happening again. But that means when we switch back over to cycles, we're not going to get anything happening here. For the moment anyway. This might be resolved. I think the intention is to have all these shaders be as cross-compatible as possible. So I'm just going to bring this material output down here, duplicate it with Shift D, and then hook this one up for up here. And then when we select this material output, it's this principled shader that we'll see in the viewport. And then what we can do is switch back to Eevee, select our material output here, and now it's going to be giving us our metallic shader. And that's really cool. I think this will be more streamlined in the future and a bit more effortless to switch. But during this little cross-shader pollination exercise, the eagle-eyed among you may have just spotted something weird with this chair, which is in Eevee, it looks kind of like this frame is all inflated somehow. But in cycles, and if we switch back up and select it there, it looks far more angular, and it's using the same normal map. As you can see here, it's branching off from there. So let's switch back over to Eevee for the moment, and then select our material output here. And just for full disclosure, let's take a look at what this normal map is actually doing. We have our normal map here at the start of the chain. This is exported out from Unreal Engine 4. I've got it set to non-color data. That's coming into these few nodes here. Since a normal map from Unreal Engine 4 is going to need the Y channel inverted, or in other words, the green channel. So that's what this is doing. And we saw it worked in cycles. So we'll just move along here into the normal map node and then into the normal socket of our two shaders, depending on what engine we're using. But yet it's all inflated. So what's going on? Well, this leads back to a huge current limitation, which is the fact that none of the modifiers are supported. So we don't have any array modifier, bevel, subdivision, armature, so on and so on, and edge split.
Now if we come over to our mesh data tab, you can see we're set to auto smooth. The whole object has been smoothed. We can tab into edit mode, we can go Control F and shade smooth that way, or we can just press T while we're in object mode. So I'm going to hit the tab key, and then we have our smooth shading there. Let's tab back into edit mode though, close that tool shelf with the T key. If I deselect everything with A, you can see this cyan line, which is indicating where we want all our sharp edges to be. Let's Control left click across that normal there, so we just get to see the native normals of the object. And you can see if we tab back into object mode, they still look all very inflated, and it's clearly ignoring our sharp edges, even though we have our auto smooth on, and even though we've painstakingly created all these sharp edges. And because of the modifier issue, we can't come over to the modifiers and bring in our edge split as a backup. So let's delete that. So what's actually going on here is a little more relevant generally, whether it's come from Unreal Engine 4 or not. And that's simply because this object should have different normals to start with, which is why our normal map isn't working properly. So let's plug that back in. If we tab into edit mode, the bits where we have these cyan lines, the shading and the normals across there should be very flat. So let's go through and see if we can select one of these sharp edges, like this one here. In fact, I'm going to turn on the gizmo, just click on it here or use Control Space. Press G to move one of these. This one. G just to move that one. Then go Shift G to select similar sharpness. And now we have all those sharp edges selected. And now I'm basically just going to rip them with the V key. So I'm going to press V and right click to cancel any move. So what that has done is if we just get one of these edges, again you can press G, and we've now got double geometry at those edges. But we now have the correct shading, and you can see now the normal map is looking correct on this object again. So I'm going to undo that with Control Z, and we're just going to move over to the middle where I've actually already gone ahead and done that with all the objects for that default Unreal Engine scene. One of the more notable changes in the interface is the addition of Viewport post-processing options over in the Properties window. So let's take a look on our rendering tab here, and this is what we're talking about, the post-process stack. At the top of that stack we have Ambient Occlusion. Let's enable this, and then we have our Ambient Occlusion in the scene. Now this is quite similar to what we're used to, shadowing that you get in parts of geometry that you would expect not as much light could reach. But this time around we have some slightly different options and a different way in which Blender is trying to calculate this for us. And we have the samples down here. If we set that down to say 2, you can see we get some very, very spotty looking ambient occlusion dots, if you like. But if we set that back up to sort of 30 or so, it smooths it right out. The distance is the sort of spread of it, and the factor is how intense that shadowing is. As for the bent normals here, if we uncheck that, you can see it's not making a massive amount of difference in this scene. So let's hop over to another scene and see if we can illustrate the difference there a little bit better. Here I have a part of this mech, which is also from Unreal Engine's content, by the way. And we have this simple metallic shader here. If we set this all the way up to 1 and toggle our bent normals option over here, you can see pretty much nothing is going to change. So we're going to need to have an unmetallic object to be able to see this do anything. So let's zoom in a little bit over here. So this is with our ambient occlusion enabled and with bent normals on. With it switched off, we get this. And then on, and then if I just keep on toggling. Now the idea behind this is to correct overly shiny parts of the geometry, or at least that's my basic understanding of it anyway. And if we take a look over here with it switched off, you can see we have quite a large amount of light coming through. If we switch our bent normals on, it shades it a little bit darker. Here I am back in the table and chairs scene just to be able to demonstrate the next thing on our post-processing stack, which is the motion blur setting. So for this we're going to need a camera with some animation information on it, which here I've just simply animated it pulling away from the table and chairs on the x-axis. You can see it starts nice and slow, goes to its maximum speed, and then slows off again towards the end. So to be able to see the effect, let's jump into the camera with 0 on the numpad. You can see we're roughly where it's at its fastest, and we can see we're getting a little bit of blurring on our objects there. Let's just clean the view up by just setting it to only render. You can see that we still get the 3D cursor though, so you might need to click that out of the scene. But otherwise, there we are. We've got our blurring and we've got some simple settings here. The shutter is just going to be how pronounced that effect is. And then maybe if we increase the shutter there, we might need some more samples to help clean it up. But I think the setting of around 16 and 1 is pretty good for me. So currently, if we're just kind of looking around and moving the viewport and so on, you can see we don't really see any motion blur. We're going to need to be inside our camera. And something else to note is if we press Alt-A from the camera view, you can kind of see this rectangular yellow outline of the camera. That might kind of spoil a render. And there's our 3D cursor as well, so let's click that out of the way. And as for that rectangular line, if we just simply select something else, like this chair for example, which I've just done, it seems to get rid of the outline for that camera. Next up in the post-processing stack is the depth of field. Let's enable that, and we're going to need our camera again, so let's press 0 to hop into this new position that I've placed it, just to give us more depth in the lens. Currently, as you can see, the chair closest to us is nice and sharp, and then the rest of the scene is all blurry. We do have some depth of field settings here, but we can pretty much just leave those at default because most of the important depth of field settings is going to be found instead on the camera itself. So if we just make sure that's selected and come over to the camera settings, you'll see I've got the distance set to 1, and the f-stop does need to be pretty low to be able to get this kind of effect. And we can simply push the distance to change what we're focusing on. So if we just focus towards the stuff that's in the background there, we're going to need to go above, say, maybe 15. And then if we want to increase the region that is in focus, we want to increase our f-stop. So if we just do that there, most of the scene now looks like it's in focus again. So just to enhance the effect, I'm going to take that really low to something like 1. Now you might be able to see pretty much the limitations of this effect at the moment. So areas where we've got all geometry with geometry in the background, it's blurring quite nicely, but with geometry towards an infinite plane, I guess, in our background here, where it's just a texture, we get these sharp transitions. So if you wanted to use this effect in real time, maybe that's something to consider with the way you go about your scene construction. Perhaps simply having a sphere with the texture on in the background would actually account for that. Okay, so I've switched everything off in our post-processing, but the next thing we've got down here is the bloom setting, which is a lot of fun. Let's take a look at the settings that we have here. Right now, the threshold is set quite low. That means almost everything in the scene is going to have a little bit of bloom applied to it. As we increase this, only the brighter things in the scene are going to have this bloom effect take place. So let's bring that back down so that almost everything in the scene feels like it's blinding us. This knee value, if we set that down to 0, my understanding of this is simply all the values above this threshold value are basically getting the bloom effect, but with this knee value, we can kind of soften that transition between it not being bloomed and it being bloomed. So somewhere around the middle is where it's at by default, and it seems fine to me. And the radius is the size of this bloom that we get, and the intensity is, well, the intensity. So we can really burn our eyes out with this thing. So let's set that back down to say something a bit more manageable, like 1. Take the radius down a little bit and put the threshold up. And now we just get a little bit of a nice bit of glare on this very bright section there, which seems to fit in this scene okay. Alright, let's take a look at some volumetrics. This is pretty fun stuff. We just need to enable it here and nothing happens. We'll get to the bottom of that in a second. First of all, just want to explain what's going on here. Just a bunch of asteroid assets from the Space VFX course has been sprinkled about the scene. And I've also got this environment texture, this Spacescape Part A.HDR from the same course. I'm just going to hook that into the background. So we've just got something hanging about in the background of those asteroids. Still no volumetrics though, because we need a shader for that. So we're going to go Shift A and bring in the volume scatter shader, drop that in, and then plug this into the volume of the world output. And then that turns off all the lights because basically our atmosphere is incredibly thick with a density of 1. So if we take that down to say something like 0.1, now some of the light is coming through. And what's very cool about this is that we also have kind of shadows coming from the objects if we have our shadows option enabled. And another important couple of settings here is the start and end. If this is set at 100, it pretty much obscures anything that you might have as an HDR coming into your background node there. So we're going to want to have this down a little bit. So for example, if I put that down to 20, it's going to reveal a lot more of the background in a similar way as just increasing the density. So you can kind of play those two settings off each other. I'm going to leave that at around 50 and take a little spin around and just sort of see how our volumetrics are working in the scene. Something that's pretty cool is the color of this volume scatter has an effect as well, as you can see there. And if I bring that back over to here, you can see also the anisotropy will have an effect as well. So we can take that down to -1 or +1 to get some intriguing effects in a very similar way to how the Cycles volume scatter works. I think it'll be really amazing if we can actually use this volume scatter not just on the world but on individual objects. I guess all that sort of stuff will be coming. Even in the meantime, I was really surprised to see that already we can hook a noise texture if we use our object coordinates into the density setting, and that will essentially just create an entire sort of cloudscape that we can fly through if you just pepper along the track some point lamps. So I've got some point lamps set to an energy of 20, and then here I'm using the full range that we've got available. I guess that's from 1 blender unit away. It's going to start and then stop at 100 blender units away. So if we hop into our camera and press Alt A, you can see what I've animated here. It's running pretty slowly, about almost 4 frames per second, but that still impresses me quite a lot considering what's actually having to be rendered here. And what's also cool is we can just take one of these lamps and then we could animate the position of this if we wanted to, which will get some really interesting results. And then also animate any of these settings for that matter. So we could get some really cool and interesting things going on. I haven't enabled volumetric shadows though in this particular example, since that seems to clog things up just a bit too much. But I do remain hopeful that we can do some very interesting things with individual objects and not just the world. Coming soon.
Okay, so it's sci-fi corridor shiny time. So we've got some reflections down here which aren't enabled at the moment. Right now it's just reflecting the environment texture. You can throw anything on here really and we'll get some sort of reflections. And also I'm going to enable volumetric. We've got the volume scatter shader there plugged into our volume. Let's go over to the object materials. Every object in the scene has this material on it. I haven't even unwrapped everything. It's just taking the object texture coordinates. I could use this to scale them up or down if I wanted to, but otherwise it's just going into an image texture with a blend value cranked up after we've set it to the box mapping. And we've got it also going into the base color and into the roughness. But I'm using color ramps to just tweak the contrast of that. Now it's almost metallic, but not quite. And I've done that for a reason, which I'll go over very shortly. Now this is just the geometry itself at the moment, but I did add a load of lights into it. So I'm just going to do that now by enabling those. And that'll help sell the volumetrics as well. Once we turn those lights on, you can see them starting to reflect in various areas, and we're starting to get a bit more grounded in the scene. And I've also added in some mesh lights as well, so if we just enable that layer, you can see I've got some lights on the walls in these kind of circular areas, but we aren't seeing any reflections from those. And there's kind of 2 ways to go on this. You could go with the screen space reflections, or we could go with the light probe reflections here. So for example, I've got a couple of probes there. If we just enable that, you can see that now this circular area here, you can see that it's starting to reflect in different areas on the wall. These won't be perfectly placed reflections, but to sell the vibe and trick the eye that this space is reflecting onto itself, those probes are doing a pretty good job. But if we just turn off those probes for the moment, and now we'll turn on our screen space reflections. Alright, so this is looking pretty good. We've got this circular area here clearly reflecting, and I think if we look to the ceiling area as well, we can see some of it reflecting there. But we are still getting a massive amount of the environment texture, so for that I'm going to want to come over and probably reduce this down a lot more, something like 0.2 in this case for this scene. And then it's a case of just tidying up our settings just to get whatever it is that we're after, but I think that's looking pretty good. To go over these settings, let's jump into a way simpler scene to make it as obvious as possible what these settings are doing. First, a couple of notes. For screen space reflections, we can actually animate them a little bit. For example, if I press G on this here, you can see the reflections are actually changing, although this clearly you need to be a little bit careful with what you do with that. In fact, screen space reflection isn't particularly ideal for this kind of reflection, this sort of mirror-like surface. We do actually have a light probe to handle this sort of stuff, a reflection plane. However, I'm kind of just setting it like this just to really illustrate what's actually happening. So let's zoom in a little bit on this green cube over here and take a look at our first setting, the half res trace. Basically, this option is whether to make it easier on the processing by simply using half of the resolution of what we see on screen instead of the full resolution. And we're using 4 samples. In fact, that's the maximum setting at the moment. We've only got between 1 and 4 to choose from. A note from the developer, Clement Foucault, is that at half resolution trace on, as we have it here, and samples of 4, that's basically equivalent of having this switched off and samples of 1. However, it's with the half res trace on with 4 samples that should run slightly smoother, even though they are pretty equivalent. So technically though, although more taxing on the system, taking the half res trace off and having maximum samples should give us the best looking results, but maybe not the fastest for our frame rate staying nice and smooth in the viewport there. Trace quality, the next setting down, this is basically just the quality of the effect, and lower values are noisier around the perimeter of the reflected shapes. Just check out around this area here, for example. And as we increase this, that's just going to reduce the noise there. Very, very high values though, say around 0.95 and above, tends to clip it a little bit. So here it'll make the cube look a bit shorter in the reflection, but a setting around 0.9 seems to be perfectly fine. For the maximum roughness, a value of 1 is doing nothing, and this is going to depend on the roughness values of the materials in the scene. So for example, with this green cube, we've got roughness of 0.6 and we've got a roughness of 0.2 on the blue cube. So let's just position the camera so we can see a little bit of screen space reflections happening in both of these objects. And as we drop this below 0.6, we're going to start to lose things in the green object, just around there. Once we get down below 0.2, for the blue object, since that's set to 0.2 roughness, we're going to see the screen space reflections reduce there as well. So as I say, a value of 1, and that's basically switched off. The thickness setting is a value used to know when a ray has hit something. In a practical sense, higher values include more into the reflections. For edge fading, we're not using any edge fading at the moment, and you'll probably notice at the edges of the screen we have this harsh cutoff. Let's zoom in a little bit further so we can see it on either side. And to smooth this out, we've got this edge fading option here. So as we increase that, we're just going to be able to blur across that and hide the severity of what's going on there. So the size of this fade is going to depend on the size of the screen. So when you're zooming your camera in on things, you're going to notice your reflections changing a little bit, so just bear that in mind. Things in the very, very middle of the screen, though, should have full reflection. And finally, we've got our clamp setting down here. A value of 0, and this is doing nothing. And a value of about 100 or so in this scene even isn't going to do anything. In fact, it's only once we get down below 1 where it's going to start to reduce the brightness that you get to see in your screen space reflections, as you can see about there. Now the usefulness of that in the higher contrast areas, sometimes it appears noisier, so we can kind of reduce that by playing with our clamp there. In a lot of cases, all we're going to need are some reflection probes. So let's take a look at them in this different scene here, just a load of mirror-like surfaces. You can see it's fully metallic, fully smooth, and that's the case for all these. If we just peek around the corner though, I have this red cube, which is just not at all metallic, and it's a little bit rough. So let's come back over to this area first, just start in between these cubes here, and let's get ourselves some reflections. So let's start off with a light probe. Let's try a reflection plane. And I'm going to press G and then Z and just lift it up ever so slightly. And then just as it pops in there, you can see that we get our perfect mirror shine. We only get our mirror reflections in the boundaries of this reflection plane though. So if we press S to scale it up, it's going to cover the area we want it to. The problem is we're only seeing the data from the actual reflection plane. We're not actually seeing the floor anymore. So if we come over to this little radiation circle here and come down to our display area, if we uncheck show data, we can now see the actual geometry of our scene with the reflections on there. Now something to note on this, if we select this main object which takes up most of the room here, reflection planes don't support roughness. So as we increase this, you can see it just basically fades it out. And so if we set that back down, we'll get them back. The cool thing about this reflection plane, of course, is that it does give us a really good opportunity for some animation. And let's reselect our reflection plane here, and we'll take a look at some of these simple settings. In the display area, we've already seen what show data does, and the influence, if we just zoom out a little bit, the influence is just this visual representation of the fall off and the distance, so we can turn those off if we want to just have a plane. And of course, the arrow size is whether we want to increase the size of that arrow or shrink it right down. So the influence itself, if we increase the distance, it now means surfaces that might be as high as this distance that we've stretched it to can actually now use the data from here. So if we go Shift A, add a mesh plane right up there, and then let's move it off to the side. Let's give it a new material, and let's make this like a mirror as well, all the way metallic and all the way down on the roughness. And let's take a look, and you can see we're getting, although it's not an accurate reflection from this high, we can actually see some of the data from that reflection plane. So let's delete that plane, and we can reselect this reflection plane. Let's take that down a little bit, something more like 1. In a lot of cases, you're probably just going to want to use this for just literally a mirror or a very shiny floor, in which case, of course, the distance is probably going to be best if we keep it really, really low. If we go back over to our screen space reflections and enable this, you'll see it kind of looks a bit crazy, but Blender knows to use the more reliable reflection plane in the area that we can use it. So it's very cool that this stuff can work well together. So a lot of these objects are very metallic and we're not really getting any problems in this reflection plane. But let's delete it with the X key and let's add in a reflection cube map instead. And you can see we get a lot of black in the scene. Let's just raise that up slightly. And if we take a look at the data, so let's come over to this radiation symbol and we can see if we toggle our show data, that's this little sphere that we get, which shows us what it's using as its reflections. And you can see all these black areas. If we select the geometry and we bring our metallic value down a little bit, and now if we just reselect our probe, which gives us these spherical outlines that we can select, and if we press G just to nudge it slightly, it'll update, and you can see now that it's no longer completely metallic, we can see some reflections that aren't black. Now you can see that there's no green and blue cubes in the reflections, and that's due to our clipping value being a little bit higher, but you might be able to tell that we probably don't really want the green and blue cubes on these back walls. And also a lot of our reflections are bending in. So in a more organic environment, this might be okay. And that's due to the fact that we're set to sphere. If we set this to box instead, for this kind of architectural-like environment, this is probably much more suitable. And you can see we're now getting more vertical lines. But let's set our clipping value down really low, like 0.1, and then press G and just nudge it a little bit. And you can see now we get our green and blue cubes showing up. But it does kind of look a little bizarre on the rest of the walls there. So that's when playing with our clipping value might really help us out. So let's create another one of these. Press Shift D to duplicate it. And let's press Y to just slide it over onto here, this side. Let's press S to scale it down. And we want another one of these reflection boxes, I guess we should say, to cater for this side of the map. So let's just scale that back up again. And although I used Shift D to duplicate, it has actually created an instance. I can see the number 2 over there. And it does look like it's just using exactly the same data from there. So let's try clicking on this number 2 and press G just to nudge it to see if anything happens. And not a lot is. So I'm going to place the 3D cursor over there, delete this one with the X key, and then throw in another reflection cube map and see if we can get something which looks a little bit different. And then we do. So we can see our little red cube shows up now. And if we come over to this one, we're still using the older reflection mapping, which is what we want for this area. So let's just come back over to this side and we'll set that one to be a box as well. So you may be able to tell by now that these reflection cube maps, the idea behind these is to place them around the scene with a little bit of overlap so that you get the coverage that you need. They're not going to be completely perfect reflections, as you can see over there, but we just need just enough to basically fake it. So what happens to an object that is in the intersection between two of these reflection cube maps? Let's just test that out. Let's grab this green cube, Shift D to duplicate it, Shift Z to move it in between without moving it up and down. And let's get rid of the green material that it's got. I'm going to select that there and just hit the minus button, and then we've got the mirror material on there. And what I'll do is grab this red cube over here, and I'm just going to stretch it out using the scale tool. So S and then X, and then something similar here, G and then Shift Z, S and then X. Let's select both reflection cube maps, press G just to jolt them a little bit, and then right mouse button to cancel that move. And now we've refreshed them essentially. So what we want to see in this cube here is a little bit of red, which we can see there. And we also want to see a little bit of green as well, and we know that it's picking up both details there. So let's select this cube, press G and then Shift Z, and we'll push it away so it falls outside of the reflection cube map zone. And you can see now it's only using the reflection cube map from over here. Let's kind of do that the other side as well. So we're getting a little bit of red in there. G and then Shift Z, and then we'll just see this fade out as well, and as it goes into that reflection zone and out of this one. And that fade can be tuned with our fall off. One last thing I'd like to take a look at on this reflection cube map is the Use Custom Parallax option. Let's delete this green object and press Shift F, and let's move into this corner of the geometry. And check out the reflections of this checkerboard pattern in the floor here. As we pan along, you can see the reflections don't really stick to where you would expect them to be. And that's what we have this Custom Parallax option for. So if we enable that, and instead of having these curved lines, I'm just going to select the box option. And now if we pan across here, you can see that they almost stick into position. If we just fine tune our size, I think we need to take that down a little bit to about there in this case. And now as we slide across now, you can see that it seems to fit a lot better.
Let's jump into this basic scene to demonstrate the last light probe that we have here, the Irradiance Volume. And the tooltip tells us that the Irradiance probe is going to capture some diffuse indirect lighting. If we're unsure as to exactly what that is, we can check out Cycles as a path tracer, and it does have indirect bounces in it. And each of these objects has two sets of shaders on, one which is going to kick in for Cycles, which is this principled shader, which has basically the same settings as the metallic shader up above, which is what Eevee is using. So let's take our rendering options and switch over to Cycles. And if we take a closer look in here, you can see on the side of this cube, we've got some blue lighting from this cube, and we've got some red lighting coming in from this cube as it bounces. If we switch back to Eevee, you can see you're not getting any of that, but that is where our hero, the Irradiance Volume, is going to come in. So if we drop that into the scene, let's just lift this up for a second just to get a clear view of it. And it's essentially this grid of points, which at each point it takes a little sample of what the lighting, what the indirect lighting should be in that area. So let's move that into the scene like this, scale it into position, S and then X, maybe like this, G and then X, just move this over, just get it right into position. You don't really want one of these points kind of inside an object, since that usually makes all the lighting in that area very dark. And there's another way you can finesse this, is to just change the resolution. So for example, perhaps it's better if we had 5 along the x-axis, or perhaps even 6, and maybe not quite as many on the z-axis. I'm sure you get the point. Let's press G and then Z and raise that down. Allow it to finish calculating. And now let's take a look. We've got a little bit of blue lighting coming on the side of this cube here, and a little bit of red just showing up on there. It could be a bit more extreme, but you can definitely see in the data that there is some red light bounce hitting that sphere there. So
And the object in this region is going to incorporate that.
And then similarly over here, the spheres are showing us that there's definitely some blue lighting hitting from this side. So any objects around that region, again, similarly will be shown to have a little bit of blue on that side. So this just gives it that extra added realism. Each time you make a little change to the scene though, you're going to want to select this, and I guess they'll put in some kind of refresh or something like that. But for the moment, we can just press G
and then right click to cancel that move, and it'll recalculate.
Let's take a look at this cube and this plane, and we'll take a look at some basic lighting. So let's go Shift A, and I'm going to add in a point lamp and press G and then move off to the side there. We don't need to worry about the node editor because none of the lamps are going to work with the nodes for the moment. So that means for now we can't use any textures on lamps like we might do with the spot lamp, for example, in Cycles. You'll notice also in this point lamp here that we've got, we're casting a shadow, but we don't have a shadow set there. But if we enable that, we can get access to these settings and then actually disable it again. So let's turn that back on. And the shadow is quite sharp, but if we take down our exponent level, once we get really, really low on there, we can kind of soften out those shadows. But that might be at the expense of kind of contact shadows with the ground. The sun lamp doesn't have any shadows at all at the moment. And I like the little sign here saying coming soon. For spot lamps, these are working pretty well. We have our size and we have our blend. I'm going to turn the blend all the way up, the softness of the spot, and also show off a little bit of the gizmos that we've got here. So you can see this little purple arrow. That's going to show us the size of our cone there. And we can tweak that. The little grey ghost of where it once was is also indicating whether we're increasing or decreasing, depending on which side of that arrow we're at. And let's press G and move this around a little bit. We'll also notice that there's this little yellow circle that we've got on there. If we can just left click accurately onto that, and wherever we place our cursor, the spot lamp is basically looking at, which I really like. I think that's pretty cool. Over on the hemi, that doesn't work. And on the area, that's working really nicely.
Great for sizing up and placing in front of windows, for example.
So let's use another really basic scene to demonstrate some transparency stuff. And that's an important distinction to make. We're looking at transparency here, not opacity. And just to indicate what's going on in this scene, we've got two objects here that share the same material, and these two in the background share the same material. We'll just keep those as opaque. And here, when we change a setting on this, we'll see what effects it makes on this cube as well. So sliding this around isn't going to do a thing initially. To get it to do something, we're going to need to come over to the Materials tab of the Properties window and set our Blend mode under the options here into one of these other modes. And the best behaving mode is Alpha Blend. When we select that, we've got a choice to see what we want to do with our shadows, but we'll take a look at that in a minute. For the moment, this alpha blend is going to allow us to have a smooth gradient of transparency all the way from completely opaque to completely transparent. Something to bear in mind is if we have something halfway or so and we just move this up here, maybe Shift D to duplicate, Shift D to duplicate,
This one, let's duplicate that material by clicking on that number 4. And rather than renaming, we'll just give it a slightly different color, something like this. And maybe you can tell as we rotate and pan and shift the camera around, the sort order of those planes is not perfect at the moment. The one that we've got selected seems to be above the others right now, and then it pops to the bottom sometimes. So just bear that in mind. I'm just going to select the other one and then delete. Let's take a look at what else we've got. We've got alpha hashed, and this behaves more like it's kind of dissolving. We've also got this alpha clip, which is basically a setting of whether it's either completely opaque or completely transparent based on our clipping value. So you can see that's right in the middle at 0.5. So as we go above 0.5, it'll just give us complete transparency. Let's take a look at multiply. Now for this, unfortunately, I don't think this is quite working properly since the transparency and color doesn't seem to make much difference at the moment. Sometimes if we tab in and out of the object, that can help, but it seems to be stuck a little bit just at the moment. So I'm sure this will be working at some point. But if we duplicate a couple of things, you might be able to see roughly what I think the intention will be. Since you can see that as we stack these up, they'll multiply on top of each other and become darker. Similarly, we have this additive mode, and you can kind of see at the point where the 3 planes are overlapping, we get the most brightness. Let's head back over to Alpha Blend, and we'll take a quick look at the transparent shadows. And now we've seen these terms before, so like hashed, for example, is going to give us these shadows, which kind of dissolves the shadow depending on how transparent it is. And we've also got opaque, which is just going to give us this shadow, but as we change our transparency, the shadow isn't going to change along with it. Just going to pretend that the object is completely opaque. And then finally we have our clip, which again is going to be set on the clip threshold and the transparency. Once we hit that transparency, it'll flip on and consider itself opaque. Something else to consider is if we come back over to our post-processing, take a look at the screen space reflection. We're not really going to get any screen space reflection where we have transparency concerned. So if we come back over and switch that to opaque, you can see things appear suddenly in our screen space reflections. As soon as we choose Alpha Blend, they're going to disappear, and that's going to be the same if we're even using a reflection cube map as well. They're basically going to dismiss anything that seems to be using transparency just at the moment. So in general, there's lots of cool little things that are in Eevee already. For example, we can come over to the color management area, and you can see that it does support Filmic. Otherwise, we're set to default and get this kind of thing with the blown out highlights. But if we come over to Filmic and we try one of these contrast settings, for example, medium high in this case,
dynamic range of the scene is nicely contained.
Hair is also supported if you have a particle system on an object, and you can set it to hair. And with these kinds of settings, that seems to be pretty nice and smooth in the viewport. If we come over to the material,
You can see I've set this as green to insinuate this is grass.
well, otherwise you could kind of go for hair or a carpet, rug, some sort of fur, whatever the case may be. It seems to render pretty nice and smooth. There is already some support for cycle shaders, as you can see in the shader list here, things like diffuse, glossy, and the mix shader. Put them together like this, and then we can switch over to cycles, and we get something very, very similar. And let's switch back over to Eevee, and it's looking pretty close. In fact, if we added in an Irradiance Volume, as we've seen before, and let that calculate for us, the similarities should be even closer. So we've got our Eevee, and we've got our cycles. And something else just to stress this is the fact that I haven't unwrapped this scene.
This is just using object coordinates.
And then I'm placing this image texture on top, blending away any sharp seams with this setting, and that's informing the base color and the roughness. That's using an image texture, but we could also just do that with noise texture. So let's grab that output. Let's control left click across there. Let's bring it down here, and then let's plug this shader into it instead. So this just has a roughness setting of 0.2 for the moment, and let's plug this in instead, and that is a noise texture. So we're getting some procedural roughness throughout now. And it also works with bump, so I've got this bump node here, and we can just plug in our normal into the normal socket, and it's basically just another noise texture going into the height socket. And there we are again, able to preview the scene before we've even unwrapped or textured anything, basically. While it is cool that we can paint within Eevee, it is currently limited to just seeing in the viewport while you're painting the image that you're actually painting onto, rather than the actual effects of how that painting is affecting your mix shader as it goes into the factor input, as we can see here. We're going to go back into texture paint mode, and it's not going to show us anything beyond this image texture. It's not going to show us any of this stuff. But that's for the moment anyway. Here I've got a metallic shader with an environment texture from HDRI Haven, and I'm just set to sculpt mode, and I'm just sculpting around on this thing, just doodling, making no sense whatsoever, but it does show that it does work quite nicely in real time. But if we switch to Dyne Topo though, we kind of get some different sort of shading here. Not exactly sure what's going on, but in any case you can still sculpt. And then once we hit optimize, we can see what that looks like, but as soon as we orbit around, it pops back. I guess it's a very, very rough version of it. So if we go to object mode and then go to roughness all the way up, it seems to be this kind of thing, although I can't be certain. I'm not sure whether there's any plans to include baking into the Eevee viewport, but we can see in the rendering panel there's no options about baking at the moment. Whereas if we jump into cycles, we can see there is a little bake section there. In fact, there's an interesting little cage that's in there for some reason. But in any case, over in Eevee, as I say, I'm not sure whether that's actually planned. I don't see why not though, since rendering is planned of course. So if we come up here, we can set our resolution. But you may dismay at the fact that there's no render buttons. Well, for that, all we need to do is just come over to the little icons that we can see here. This one on the left for a snapshot of the screen, and this one will render out the animation frame range. So if we just hit that there, we get our render. And the render seems to be a little bit smoother than we get in the viewport. I think the anti-aliasing within the viewport is planned and coming. For the moment, the anti-aliasing rendering options appear to still just be in the Blender render options. So if we make our changes here, we can affect how that render appears in Eevee. Another quick note is that we could render at 50%, we can render at 100%, but we can also render, say, at double the power at 200%, and then maybe even scale down that way if we wanted to. I think a lot of work is going on behind the scenes of Blender all over the place, so Blender Game Engine, it makes perfect sense to try and incorporate this viewport into it and any other offshoot game engine projects. So this video is long enough already. Let us know what you'd like us to dig into deeper on this subject. 2.8 is expected to be way more stable by the end of 2017, at which point we'll do a more exhaustive breakdown. But until then, it's hard to resist seeing where things are at midway through development. If you want to follow along with development, you can check out this page here for all the latest commits. And check this out, there's a fix for the multiply blend mode. We can also go over to Twitter and search for the Blender commit logs Eevee related. And again, there's that fix the multiply blend mode. Some of the developers you can follow along with on Twitter who post 2.8 progress is Clement, which I'm sure I always mispronounce. We've also got Mike Irwin, who did last year's 2.8 Blender conference talk. And we've also got Dalai Filinto, who also, by the way, worked on a VR add-on for Blender. So there is every chance that could show up for 2.8 too. Here is Dalai's VR link, and it looks like that's currently for Blender 2.77, though you can check that out in any case. I find it always immensely fun just seeing what people are doing with Blender. And of course, on Twitter, you can also just type in #Eevee as a filter and just generally find interesting trials that people are doing. And a fair bit of Pokemon as well, since I believe Eevee is one of the Pokemon names. Though I believe that's just an accidental similarity, rather than some homage of some kind, like Suzanne the Monkey. And that's all for now. I'll leave you with this Eevee roadmap. So whether you're creating assets for games or you're using Cycles as your main rendering engine and want a very close real-time preview on your final result, you'll probably be wanting to check out the Eevee viewport in either case.